All I know is that the last 24 hours were more stressful than 9/11 for all the politics artists out there. We have more resources, we have more tools available than ever before in the history of mankind. Yet the incentives are as misaligned as they have ever been.
And why do you think a world where the US isn't the leading nation is not a world you want to see?
Even if you're both among the top 10 most powerful men in the world, you're not able to solve your conflicts any better than two kindergartners.
Yeah.
And that's pretty pathetic. They would be much more successful if they would step down from that moral pedestal that they're claiming for themselves. What becomes more feasible in turn, which is short-term hedonism, chasing dopamine, becoming addicted to everything. Well, what have we seen yesterday?
What's going on?
Clash of the Titans.
Okay, so Trump versus Elon. TLDR. Elon funds Trump campaign with millions. Trump gets elected. Elon gets Doge, tries to cut costs, realizes he can't really fight the deep state. Semi gets kicked out or leaves. And now there's a shit show public fight on Twitter. And apparently Trump is on the Epstein list. That's my understanding of what was going on.
All I know is that the last 24 hours were probably more stressful than 9/11 for all the politics artists out there. The timeline has been eating good. As you said, there's been a fallout over the spending bill called Big Beautiful Bill by Trump. Doge was the austerity program started by Elon, and I guess these efforts have now come to an end because nobody ever gets elected for austerity. Perhaps this is the final confirmation that monetary expansion and irresponsible spending will continue and is inevitable. This is arguably bullish for risk assets, including our funny internet monies, but incredibly bearish humanity, in my point of view.
Why do you think bearish?
Well, nobody is taking any responsibility for their actions anymore. And it all starts and ends with economic incentives, and the monetary system plays a huge role in that, and within the monetary system, government deficits play a very large role.
Do you think government deficits are a bad thing?
Temporarily, they wouldn't be if there was a government surplus to cancel them out. But obviously, there's nothing as permanent as a temporary government program. So yeah, I view them as a big problem.
Why are they a big problem?
Because it legitimizes and economically incentivizes societal weakness. It's disgusting.
Why?
Well, if you have a society that is a true meritocracy where everybody has to be a useful and a productive member to make money to get by, then you have an inherent incentive to make something out of yourself. If you look at the distribution of who's paying the largest share of taxes, what kind of consumerism trends you're seeing, the development of health in the population, not only physical health, but also mental health and the entire meaning crisis that you see in my generation and the younger generations. The types of products that are being built, the innovations that are being pushed. Essentially, over the last 2 decades, we have not seen anything useful. We have more resources, we have more tools available than ever before in the history of mankind. Yet the incentives are as misaligned as they have ever been. And every day I'm trying to convince myself that these incentive misalignments are not beyond remorse. But I think it's getting much more difficult day by day. And this alliance between the tech Silicon Valley people and the pragmatist Republicans was the only viable political alliance, at least in the US, to change things, irrespective of if you agreed with the policies that Musk and Trump pushed forward and these fractions forward. The composition of their alliance was the only viable thing that could have caused any societal and economic progress in the West. And personally, I was genuinely optimistic on revival of what we called ourselves the Free West when Trump got elected in November. Not necessarily because I'm a huge fan of his persona or his policies, but because I think that his election and the influence of people who build stuff would just kick off an effect, not only in the US, but also in Europe, that people would finally get back into doing things and not just yapping about it and protesting about it and being enraged by everything. And yeah, I think this has been quite a bit of a setback we've seen there yesterday, because it again shows that even if you're both among the top 10 most powerful men in the world, you're not able to solve your conflicts any better than two kindergartners.
Yeah.
And that's pretty pathetic.
That I agree on. The last point. I think that is interesting how the memes are generational on this. My favorite
Timeline was eating.
my favorite
Eating.
my favorite one was, I'm not sure if it was during Trump's inauguration or when they did some celebration post-election, where Elon Musk, probably in the K-hole, was like, hey, yeah, like super happy.
Oh, the
Barron-
Trumping meme or...
No, Barron was in front, and Barron was not even smiling, just super straight, and people were like, that Barron saw this coming, and he was in another timeline.
He saw it coming, the Lisan al-Ghaib.
Exactly. That was goated. Long time ago, I opted out from politics in the sense that I don't want to spend any brain capacity on it, as it bores me. I can't really change much, and I just want to be productive with my time or do something that I enjoy. But this was unavoidable. You know, it was in our face, and especially if you're on X. Did you see Elon retweeting a tweet from Trump in 2012 where he's like, it shouldn't be allowed for a politician to be reelected when there's when they have a deficit, and Elon is like, I couldn't agree more. So on that topic, I wanna dive a little bit deeper. So if we just double click on the topic of a deficit, my understanding is nation states are not supposed to be run like companies. So it matters less whether you are in a surplus or in a deficit. On the contrary, if the deficit fuels growth, and if a surplus would lead to a reduction in growth, it may actually be worse. Because naturally, if you're a country that exports more, you're going to be in a surplus. If you're a country that imports more, you're going to be in a deficit. However, the goods that you import...
No, these are trade deficits. That has nothing to do with government.
Oh, that's the household? I see. Yeah.
The trade deficit is a completely different discussion.
Okay, I was thinking about the trade deficit.
The trade deficit is fine, given that the US is the monetary hegemon on planet Earth. They are the only nation that can engage in theoretically printing an infinite amount of dollars and exports them and imports an infinite amount of goods.
Exactly.
So the trade deficit in the position that the United States is in, with the dollar being the dominant currency, I think makes sense. Government deficits, on the other hand, technically a government or a country does not have to be run like a corporation, because there's, especially in the case of the US, you're not inherently forced to default on your obligations because you can just print more money. No company on planet Earth has a monopoly over violence, nor does it have a monopoly over the money printer. So they cannot print themselves out of anything. If they cannot pay back their loans, they're going to default. Whereas it looks quite different with a country. And given that the US is in the position of the US dollar being the major export of that nation, they can in theory print as many of these things as they want. However, what I alluded to earlier, if you have people spending other people's money on other people, that is the inherently most inefficient allocation of funds that is out there. And it encourages irresponsibility, it encourages short-term thinking, it encourages hedonism, and it just deeply undermines society. And I don't know if it's the Caesar versus Pompey moment in the kind of Roman Empire parallel, or if it's Constantine's civil war, which marked the beginning of the end. I hope it's the former, not the latter, because I agree with almost every criticism over US dominance in the world that is out there, but I think we can all agree on that whatever would come next or whatever would replace the US dominance would be much worse. And personally, I do not want to live in a world like that.
Okay, so you are TLDR, you are pro Elon?
I don't really care about picking sides. I recognize the whole deficit discussion as a very important one, and I'm libertarian leaning, so I'm necessarily against a lot of government intervention, and that includes government spending, of course. In terms of picking sides on that specific conflict, I don't really care. I'm not sure what exactly led them to escalate it in that manner. It's nothing that matters to me because it doesn't, I mean, taking a position there doesn't solve anything. But from a principle standpoint, I'm probably more aligned with Elon than I am with Trump.
And why do you think a world where the US isn't the leading nation is not a world you want to see?
Well, what are the relevant alternatives? In the last century, we've had the free West and free market liberalism compete with Soviet socialism and communism. That was the Cold War that came to an end in 1990. And as we've discussed in, I think it was the first or the second episode of our podcast, from 1990 until 2021, we had an unprecedented global peace and global kumbaya in terms of an absence of globally relevant conflicts. There was no World War going on. There was no Cold War going on that was carried out between the big powers of planet Earth. Of course, there were wars. There was Yugoslavia, a bunch of stuff in Africa, a bunch of stuff in the Arab region, but nothing that affected the globe as a whole and nothing that affected the major economies as a whole. That came to an end in 2020, where the dependencies and the risks of relying on a globalized economy got exposed. And ever since, we've been in some limbo where the world isn't able to figure out how we're going to go forward. You have seen a rise in geopolitical conflicts with Russia, Ukraine, and Israel, Palestine, which the US has not been able to solve or intervene in or create peace, even though they are still the presumed hegemon. And now if you look at, okay, what are the relevant alternatives? Coming up after the US is China, Russia, and the Islamic world. In the Islamic world, you have a lot of internal differences. So while in Europe, the major societal conflict right now is the secular West versus the Islamic immigration, I don't think it's the same issue in the US. First of all, because the demographics are a lot different there, and also the influences and the power is distributed in a quite different way. So what is left is the free West, free market economy West, and the state capitalist, state socialist Chinese economy. And there's that narrative out there that China just wants to be recognized and China doesn't care about expansionism as Western nations and cultures like the European ones or the US do care about. I don't think that is true. If you look at China's demographics, if you look at China's economy, if you look at their behavior, it is nothing that is long-term sustainable. Their entire real estate market is a complete Ponzi. Their demographics are collapsing. And the only way to continue fueling all of their consumerism and the wealth of their populace is by becoming an expansionary and a parasitic power. And if you look at what they are doing in Africa by buying up and funding a lot of infrastructure, and they're doing that in a very smart and a very sophisticated manner, I do think that is pointing more towards expansionism rather than just wanting to be on an equal playing field. And looking at these larger scale conflicts, especially the ideological conflicts we have on Earth right now, namely secular West versus Islamism and free market capitalism versus a state-controlled Chinese capitalism or Chinese socialism or however you want to call it, I do not want to live in either of those. I prefer the model we're living in right now, as flawed as it is. I think there are terminal flaws in the model we have been pursuing over the past decades as the free West as well. And I don't think that the current, what we call liberal democracy, is the end-all be-all, because there are some incentive misalignments that are simply not going to fix themselves. But compared to the relevant alternatives, I think we can view ourselves as pretty lucky there.
How do you think the situation is going to resolve?
I'm not sure. If the fallout continues between the libertarian and tech optimist leaning Silicon Valley and the pragmatic Republican leaning fraction in the US, if that continues, it makes it much more likely that someone from the economic left up to Marxist candidate will run for presidency in 2028. Could be somebody like AOC or maybe Elizabeth Warren. I think she would be a sufficient example for that fraction too. And if any of these people win, I think that United States exceptionalism is absolutely dead, and that the US supremacy in the world will come to an end. Maybe not within these 4 years, but I think if this happens, then we'll get to a state where it is irreversible. And again, like, I dislike the US having so much influence and not being forced to take responsibility for all the crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, etc., that they have committed over the past 30 years. But again, comparing it to all relevant alternatives, it's still the lesser evil. Unless Europe is able to completely turn itself around within the next 5 years, which it doesn't look like as of now, it's going to be a difficult time. And all the economic misalignments that we are dealing with right now already, they're only getting worse. Deficits are going to grow. You're seeing it in Germany. You're seeing it in every other European country. You're seeing it in the US. And again, if you have, like the US, 36 trillion government deficit, there's no government surplus on earth that will ever be able to cancel this out. And the only things it encourages are increased reliance on societal welfare, increased reliance on not doing anything useful. It is an overproduction of useless academics. It is an overproduction of white-collar jobs. Nobody is doing anything useful. Nobody's doing anything real anymore. And I think that is a huge problem.
With the rise of AI, don't you think there's going to be less and less useful things? Or maybe to put it differently, AI will be used and be utilized to do many of the productive or required things that are being done by humans today. If that's the case, isn't that the default? Like, what's left to do?
And I think that all the white-collar and office jobs are going to be automated much faster than anything manual. Because so far, most of the progress in AI that we have seen has been in the digital sphere, not in the robotic sphere. So what would get automated, hopefully, at first would be accountants, tax advisors, lawyers, all of these things. And what we would be left with is building real estate, construction, agriculture, retailers of food, clothes, etc., which I think are not amazing jobs to have, but usually the people who carry out these jobs derive more meaning from them than some very dull, sitting in front of an Excel sheet 10 hours a day type of job. If I look around in my friend circle, most of the people there are in very high-paying, high-status, white-collar jobs, management consultants, investment bankers. Some are in asset management, some are in startups. Some of them are very aware of the entire Gen Z and millennials career meaning crisis and meaning crisis of life. Some are trying to deny it, but I do have the feeling that every single one of them deep down is affected by that. If you just look at how people are living in my generation, we are not producing any functional members of society. Berlin might be an extreme example of that, but if you look around, most people are not even able to manage their own household. It is absolutely pathetic. Most people are not, have zero, like, skills to even build an IKEA shelf. Most people are not able to load and unload a dishwasher, to clean their room.
Why do you think that?
Just look around. If you see their apartments, the way they manage these things, it is so incredibly inefficient. The average young adult, they feel overwhelmed by having to buy their own groceries, by having to walk 5 minutes to a grocery store and pick out some stuff that is not completely unhealthy and is going to poison them. They feel overwhelmed by that and by just the having to bear responsibility for the basics of life, because it has become the default that you do not have to contribute to society anything anymore. The default has become that you can pick some useless college degree which you will entertain yourself with for 5 years or even longer if you can delay it, then go into some useless job, define your identity with whatever. You see all of these identity crises things. People have to identify, may it be with one or the other side of the culture war, may it be with some other, like the current thing. People have to identify with the Israel-Gaza conflict, with the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And I'm not saying anything against speaking up for any of these issues. I mean, these are important issues that are important to solve, no doubt about that. But people are putting so much energy in stuff that they do not have an actual impact on, instead of cleaning up their own room before they try to go out and save the world. People need to get back to fixing the basics of their lives.
I'm not sure I agree with that, because there's being a good athlete and there's being a good coach. And I think you don't need to necessarily be the best athlete to be a good coach, right? So I think I hear where you're coming from. Also, my experience is not like that. Most adults I deal with, they're very on top of their private life. They can build IKEA shelves and they can manage their groceries, including their kids, very well. So I wonder if that's a younger generation observation.
Probably. I think the decline is quite exponential if you go down the cohorts.
Interesting. Yeah, that could be it. But do you support the current thing?
Depends on what the current thing is.
Mark Andreessen tweeted about it recently.
Well, what did he tweet about?
That he supports the current thing.
Oh, the current thing?
Yeah. I love that meme.
On the note of AI, I do agree with you that it is the biggest lever we have right now for any productivity increase. And we can get rid of a lot of what I would put into the category of anti-human activities. Not necessarily that they are harmful, but that they are useless and rather meaningless and not really suited for the human body and the human mind, which are all of these repetitive office type of tasks. So there definitely is a lot of potential, but we should not underestimate the impact and the importance of baseline economic incentives. We can have all the cool AI tools, we can have all the resources. If there are no agreed upon, efficient, and streamlined incentive structures that determine the directional allocation of any of these things, I don't think that there will be a single positive outcome in the mid to long run. And that is something that we have been completely neglecting. All the talk is about culture war and all of these socio-political things, but nobody is paying any attention to the underlying economic incentives. Take the housing crisis, for example. It is being talked about a lot, but it is rarely ever being talked about in context to the other developments we are seeing. Everybody who's complaining about Gen Z not being willing to work anymore, this is completely accurate. Nobody is willing to work anymore because nobody has any possibility with a normal job to live up to the living standard that, for example, my grandparents or my parents' generation has been living with the same amount of income. Housing is a huge factor in that. If people don't even have the prospect of buying a home by working a decent, on average job, that is a huge disincentive because nobody feels like they are able to build a life worthwhile living in the mid to long run. And if that becomes less feasible, you got to ask yourself what becomes more feasible in turn, which is short-term hedonism, chasing dopamine, becoming addicted to everything, just living for the moment, etc. This has become very cheap, and not only has the more long-term oriented lifestyle become more expensive, but even the wrongful decisions that you might make when opting for a more short-termist lifestyle, you don't even have to bear the costs for any of these things anymore. Because in Germany, there's Bürgergeld, or there's like any other type of state-funded program that is going to catch you once you fall. So there is a complete absence of taking responsibility for the risks you're taking.
I mean, on the one hand, it's an issue that these things are abused. But don't you think that, like, for example, you took Germany as an example, it's kind of a known problem that your household and your parents' education basically determines your future, right? If you're from an academic household, it's much more likely that the kid is going to become an academic, vice versa. So don't you think a social state such as Germany, where its goal is to ease out some of these inequalities, is one thing versus that being abused by certain people is a whole nother problem. But also, globally speaking, You talk a lot about activity and white collar jobs and a lot of like admin overhead. I just wonder how the world will, where things will be in the next 5 years.
I don't know. The most likely case that I see is that we are able to automate away a lot of the administrative functions that I alluded to earlier. And we will see an increased polarization of society on every level. May it be wealth creation, may it be cultural expression. It pretty much touches every aspect of life. I would argue that for the last 1.5 years, we've seen countercultures on the rise that are opposed to many of the trends that we've seen over the last 10 to 5 years. Veganism versus carnivore and like raw food. That is one of these microcultures where you see that conflict unfold. Then the whole Gen Z, millennial, big city life versus trying to buy up some old farm, renovate it, and live on the countryside. The trends of political polarization that you've seen in the US, they have also taken hold in Germany, in France, in Italy, pretty much everywhere we go. It's not that people had less different political opinions in the past, but at least they were able to talk to each other and to maintain friendships, even though they had completely different views on some things. And I would claim that in my friend circle, I have every view represented from Marxist leftists up to far right people. And I can be friends with any of these. But if I talk to my right wing friends, they'll try to accuse me of being a traitor, how I am able to stay friends with the leftist fraction. And the leftist fraction gets all enraged how I can even consider these evil right wing people as a human because they're so bad. They're such terrible people. You see that dehumanization of the political enemy on both fronts. I don't think that there's anybody holding a moral superiority there. One of the few things that I appreciate about the populist political right is that they are at least very direct and very honest with their intentions. Whereas what I find very annoying on the leftist front, on the other hand, is that they always cling to their moral superiority. They are rarely ever able to explain why their demanded policies or their ideal view of the world is going to work or why it is better. But they always start from a position of there's a black and white, good and evil, we are the good ones, and that is why it has to be our way. May it be applied on the Democrats or the leftist parties in Germany, I think they would be much more successful, not only in gaining voter share, but also in just being able to open more people up to their positions if they would step down from that moral pedestal that they are claiming for themselves. And if they were talking more about, okay, on a policy level, why does this make sense? Why is this good? Not starting out by the point, we are the moral superiors, we know how a world is to look like, and if you don't agree with us, you are an evil person. These trends of polarization, I deeply hope that it will improve and that we get back to a somewhat functional culture of debate and discussion. But I don't know if that is going to happen because AI, social media, increased digitalization of everything, it makes it much more easy to stay isolated in your current political microcosm. You see that on Twitter. For example, like the typical tech and crypto Twitter bubble. When I speak to some friends of mine, I've caught myself several times in the last couple of weeks now that I assumed that they were aware of all of these developments that were not necessarily isolated to crypto, but just macroeconomy and some cultural memes associated with that. Some of them are completely unaware what is happening, even though within your bubble, it seems as if this is globally relevant right now. And you probably have hundreds of these micro bubbles distributed across every issue of politics, economics, tech, and like other hobby interests. So it's just become very obvious that achieving any type of large-scale, may it be national or global coordination and incentive alignment between all of these stakeholders, it's becoming increasingly difficult. And I don't know if that is going to change.
Interesting. Don't you think that the relevance of US politics and USA in general is overestimated? Like, do people in Asia really care that much? Do people in Europe really care that much? We are in a very specific bubble on X, especially. I think we care more than the average, or at least we're more exposed to US politics than the average. But on a global scale, how much do you think it actually matters?
In the short term, the fundamental implications are completely irrelevant. But in the mid to long term, I would argue that at least for the Western nations, so the US, Canada, I would count Mexico towards that, Europe and Australia and New Zealand, the developments in US culture, which usually precedes US politics, it does have a significant effect. If you just look at the Overton window of what is allowed and tolerated to be said on large media stations and on social media and in society at large. If you just take the outcome of the US election last year as an example, it had a measurable effect on these other nations. And many of these effects are not directly visible, like this Overton window in socio-political discourse. Other effects are a little more subtle. For example, the government debt and economic incentives discussion. But these things are relevant because they dictate a lot of incentives. They have an influence on global trade because all of these nations are intertwined. The US is a huge market for many foreign companies. Then on the other hand, US defense and US military activity is incredibly relevant for all the other Western nations. So arguably for Europe and everything that counts itself towards the free West, it is relevant. For the Asian countries, obviously less so. In the immediate term, for the average citizen, it doesn't affect them at all. Mid to long term, there may be some economic implications, for example, for China or Vietnam or India, which export quite a few goods to the US. If the whole tariff thing is being maintained or escalated, that would affect them. On a socio-political level, less so, because the cultures there are different, the politics there are different, and I also think that they refer to different cultural influences there.
I think I can agree with that. Yeah, no, it is kind of quite crazy. The media was saying Musk is the de facto president, or Trump's policies are basically going to favor Musk. Now the big beautiful bill apparently does not favor Musk at all. There's some EV subsidies that are being discontinued, which I don't know if that's such a big deal for Musk. He says it's not the real problem. But yeah, it's a crazy timeline to be in. I don't know. Like, who would have seen this coming? This bromance coming to an end so quickly.
There are quite a few people who have at least wanted it to end. Pretty much everybody who is not aligned with Trump's policies. If I talk to my US friends who are on the Democrat side, most of them are dancing on the graves of that bromance right now. So they're quite happy that it ended. Because again, it was the only functional political union between any two political and economic fractions in the US that you currently had. And the Democrats were obviously not part of it. I guess they're quite happy that this ended. To make the circle back to what you mentioned previously, that in your environment, you don't really see these trends of societal dysfunctionality and degeneration. From your perspective, is there any optimistic case that people in my generation and younger could orient themselves along? The immediate implications of this whole Trump versus Musk thing, they are almost irrelevant, but they are just another example that expose the misalignments and incentives we have in economics, in politics, in societal discourse right now. And yeah, how do you cope?
How do I cope with what exactly?
The state of society. What I've noticed is that some friends of mine, they just try to completely blend out anything that is politics related or culture related, and all they do is focus on their own monetary success and don't care about anything else. They don't care about the mid to long term implications of what they are doing professionally as long as it makes money. While I would doubt that this leads to long term fulfillment and meaning, because if you're chasing after fake money that is going to buy you fake assets, it's not really something worth sacrificing your life for. It is keeping them over the water in the short to midterm. And most of these people are doing all right, if not better, than the ones who are in this eternal state of worry about the current thing or whatever is set to be important right now.
I'm probably close to your friends that. I mean, it's basically my comment regarding I opted out from politics. And the reason for that is I was very into politics when I was young, and I cared about everything. I wanted to make a difference. I thought there was a lot of inequality. I was going to demonstrations. I wanted to become politically active until I realized triggering change politically is a game that I don't like. I don't like to join a party. I don't like to do political work that these people are doing. I'd much rather, in my smaller cosmos, trigger change that I can control. So that's when I started a company, because I thought, hey, I can build something that I think makes sense, and I can create my own ecosystem where I can work on small projects. And it's not necessarily the financial aspect that you mentioned only. Honestly, the financial aspect is always a side effect, but I think it's not the primary motivation. The primary motivation is independence, freedom to work on what I want to work on, not for someone else to tell us what to do. And obviously, we are very well aware and opportunistic that there can be financial upside, but I'm on that side. So in that sense, I observe everything curiously. I enjoy it from an entertainment perspective. It's like grab popcorn and see how it plays out. I'm not worried societally that things are going to shit, to be honest with you. I think there are things that are very bad that I would want to change. But on the other hand, it's not as bad as it seems. And I would love to speak more to younger generations and people like you and understand where disheartening and kind of the pessimism for the future and dystopia comes from, if that were to be the main observation.
I guess it depends what aspects you're looking at. I 100% agree that every objective metric of life has been going up only for the last couple of decades. On average, between 1990 and 2020, we've been lifting more than 100,000 people every single day above the extreme level of poverty, etc. Life expectancy going up, shortage of food going down. There are probably more people dying from the consequences of obesity than of starvation by now. So all these objective metrics, 100% agree. I think the aspects of life that touch upon spirituality, finding meaning, interpersonal relations, everything regarding that has been going down in that same time frame. At least when I look at the stories that I hear from people older than me and what I notice in my own generation. I wouldn't say that it is a dystopia, but it is some uncertain limbo which nobody knows how to solve. Because nobody knows what is there left to aim at and to work towards. Because, at least to most people in the West, it seems as if all the big problems of society are already solved. What does that incentivize people to do? To focus all their effort, all their time, and all their energy on cultural or political or societal issues that they cannot actually affect. And even if they would be able to turn these things in the direction that they are protesting for or are doing their activism for, it would introduce a ton of very unfortunate second and third order consequences. Because they are in desperate search of finding something new to gain meaning from. That's the issue there that weighs down on the perceived quality of life of many people, even though the objective quality of life, if you compare to any other moment in the history of mankind, is incredibly high. We are standing on the shoulders of titans. I think we are perpetually underestimating the pure magic and the wonder that any of this in everyday life actually works. It is insane, and I think it's perpetually underappreciated. On the note of politics, I fully agree that engaging in politics is a negative EV game. Personally, I've been involuntarily involved in it for the past, I would say, 10 years of my life. I've tried to completely pull out of it probably a handful of times, never succeeded. At least a year later or 2 years later, I got pulled back into it by some stupid reason, and by now I have accepted my fate that I will probably never be able to get rid of it, because you might not care about politics, but politics unfortunately cares about you, and especially the people who feel to be in the position of dictating how you should live your lives are caring about you in that negative sense. So if you're not sitting on the table, you are on the menu. I think that's the TLDR for engagement in politics. It's a stupid game. It's an unfortunate game. But to defend your own liberty and your own sovereignty, you have to unfortunately engage in it to some extent. So I don't think that we'll be able to completely get out of there unless we are seeing a complete shift to localization, city-states, free private cities, etc. As it looks right now, and looking at the experiments that have been conducted around that field, none of them have achieved outstanding success.
I do agree with that. I do agree with that. Any last thoughts from your side on this topic?
In terms of how to cope or to find an optimistic case?
No, just in general. Either way. Do you have a prediction for how things will play out? Do you think there's going to be a resolution? Do you think it's theater to distract from other things?
I don't think that there's any conspiracy theater. It's just two powerful people with two very big egos getting at each other and being unable to solve a conflict in a adult manner. The position of these two individuals just makes the attention this conflict attracts very overrated in the short term. People shouldn't be overly worried about this thing. And I mean, it's super entertaining. I think last night on X was one of the funniest evenings I've had in the last couple of months, because the memes were outstanding. The quality of conversations there, it was just hilarious. So you could have had a lot of fun there. In the mid to long run, however, this issue is just another example that showcases how misaligned the incentives actually are. That regardless which party is in power, which person is in power, these people care more about themselves and irresponsibly spending money on their constituents and not paying attention to the second and third order consequences, and not paying attention to the inevitable consequence that somebody will have to pay for all of these bills. Not physically, obviously through a soft default, which happens through the dilution and devaluation of the currency. These are relevant, and these are big, and these are important problems that we need to pay attention to, because again, I mean, you're not that old either, and arguably we are the ones who are going to pay these bills, and we are the ones who are going to suffer these consequences. And I am not willing to pay up the bills for older generations who have already overconsumed and manipulated time through outstandingly low interest rates throughout their entire lives. I'm not their free-for-all. I'm not going to pay for their vouchers. I mean, I kind of have to, but I'm not willing to. Events like the one we've seen yesterday is another invitation to deal more with timeless things to study, like economic mechanisms, incentive mechanisms, how these things play out. With this tech and pragmatic Republican alliance likely having failed right now, it encourages everybody to zoom out again and see this is the state of things. There was a chance that Elon could have contributed to the reduction of the deficit and pushed a little bit for austerity. That now has failed. Where are we at right now? What can we do in our own little microcosm? And I would encourage people to look beyond short-term monetary success, because in a not physically but metaphorically fake economy, you can make a lot of money with useless crap everywhere. If I look at many of the businesses that my friends have, if you just put in the hours, if you just put in the effort, you don't have to be particularly smart about it. It is very likely that you're going to be off well enough and you're going to get by. However, instead of just looking at the corporate equivalent of I'm working so hard, I'm working so many hours, and I'm making so much money, maybe pay a little more attention to, is your job actually useful? Like, are you contributing anything to the sectors that improve the bottom line quality of life? Namely, agriculture, energy infrastructure, hospitality, anything that is related to food, beverages, medicine, health, exercise, sports, whatever it is, interpersonal relations. Like, are you bottom line making the quality of life of you and the people around you better? Because I'm not willing to give up the opinion that a long-term egoist that is optimizing on long-term maximizing payoff is going to be maximally collaborative with everybody else and is going to create the maximum amount of value for society at large out there. I desperately hope that this thesis holds true. What I've seen over the past couple of months and years and weeks has probably spoken against that. I mean, it's a tricky time because regardless what aspect of life you're looking at, the time of easy answers seems to be over. There's just so much out there. You can look at so many different numbers, you can look at so many different opinions, at so many different philosophical interpretations. It is hard to find a clear-cut framework, may it be for your individual life, for your own life and one of your family, friends, or for an entire nation state, which provides practical answers. And I think there are a lot of topics that need solutions. So go out there and go make yourselves useful.
With that, thanks a lot for your opinion. I'm super curious to see how it plays out, and we're going to have answers when we record the next episode.
I hope so.
Thanks, Max.